Thank you for waiting and welcome to the Cambridge Service Alliance webinar series. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Jingchen Hou and Professor Andy Neely. The presentation that Jingchen is going to conduct today is called Investigating Risk of Outcome-Based Service Contracts from a Provider Perspective. Thank you, Jingchen.
Thank you, Veronica. So today I'm going to introduce a paper we submitted to International Journal of Production Research. So it is a research on risks of outcome-based service contracts from a provider's perspective. So I'm going to introduce first the research background and the motivation, and then I will introduce literature review and the research design, followed by the research findings, and finally our discussions and conclusions. So a bit of the background. We talk a lot about servitization of manufacturing. So increasingly, manufacturing companies are providing more and more services. And with the increased depth of servitization, different types of services can be provided. And they range from basic services such as after-sale service to intermediate services such as conditional monitoring to advanced services where availability and capability are provided. Even though it is not one-to-one correspondence, but different forms of commercial agreements and contracting often accompany these different forms of services. So basic services are often accompanied by contracts that cover inputs, such as traditional time and material contracts. And in intermediate services, they sometimes use service level agreements which focus on the outputs. And when advanced services are provided, they sometimes have gain share and pen share mechanisms that are incorporated into outcome-based service contracts or performance-based contracts. The adoption of new pricing policies can introduce risks for servitizing firms, and this is especially the case for the adoption of outcome-based contracts. From being contracted on inputs or outputs to being contracted on outcomes, providers usually take on increased risks. So for time and material contract, providers are paid based on consumed resources and take few risks. And when service level agreements are adopted, providers are paid for services delivered often to a pre-agreed service level. And providers face risks associated with their failure to deliver to these agreed service levels. And in outcome-based contracts, more risks are introduced to providers for three reasons. So first, the high complexity of delivering total solutions leads to high risks naturally. And second, in many cases, providers don't have full control of the outcomes, which are affected by many external factors such as different stakeholders, customers' behaviors, etc. And the third reason is that by providing outcome-based contracts, providers usually take on responsibilities that were previously taken on by their customers. And together with the transfer of responsibilities, risks are transferred to the providers. And for these reasons, both academia and industry practitioners are very interested to understand more and unveil risks of outcome-based contracts. And to answer this research question about risks of outcome-based contracts, we follow this research design. So in the first step, we review widely literature on risks of outcome-based contracts to define what is outcome-based contract and to identify the research gap. So it shows that in the literature, people tend to find risks are very important in outcome-based contracts, but there is limited research, limited systematic research on risks of outcome-based contracts. And in the second stage, we reviewed secondary interview data, and from these secondary data, risks rise both at the contract negotiation stage and also at the contract implementation stage. And based on the secondary interview data, we conducted 24 semi-structured primary interviews. And the focal companies are pioneering in servitization, and the interviewees were or are involved in the negotiation and the implementation of outcome-based service contracts. And these companies cover a wide range of industries, such as industrial equipment manufacturing and services, medium, IT, telecommunications, aerospace, etc. And from the primary data, we identify 23 risk factors leading to commercial risk and operational risk. And these 23 risk factors are in 5 dimensions. I will introduce them later in this presentation. First, let's look at the literature review. We define outcome-based contracts based on some of the literature review. So in the literature, outcome-based contracts, or in other names, performance-based contracts, performance-based contracting, performance-based logistics, they have been defined variously. So in general, they refer to contracts where customers focus on or pay for outcomes of equipment, the accomplishment of performance goals, or outcomes of customer value instead of activities, tasks, behaviors, individual components, a set of prescribed specifications, and how to achieve the performance goals. And in this research, we define outcome-based contracts as an agreement between the provider and the customer, that the provider provides total solutions and is paid based on the outcomes of total solutions or the outcomes of customer value in a continuous use situation. There are 3 elements of outcome-based contracts. First, regarding the offerings. So in outcome-based contracts, total solutions are to be delivered instead of individual components, such as pure products or individual service activities. And the contracts specify outcomes instead of inputs, processes, or outputs. And second is regarding the payment. So the payment the provider receives depend on the outcomes of the total solutions or the outcomes of customer value. In the former situation, the outcomes or performances of what is delivered are contracted for. So for example, the availability contracts in the defense industry, where the provider has responsibility to ensure the availability of aircraft to be at a certain level and to carry out all related services, are outcome-based contracts. And in the latter situation, what the customer achieves in its own business with the total solutions that are delivered by the provider are contracted for. So for example, in the education industry, the contracts where service providers provide education solutions to colleges and are contracted for the pass rates or the graduation rates of the college students are outcome-based contracts. And the third is about the relationship. So the agreement should be in a continuous use situation, referring to the relational instead of transactional nature of the relationship between the provider and the customer in outcome-based contracts. So I'm going to introduce the research findings. The first is we find that risks rise both at the contracting stage and at the delivery stage. And risks at the contracting stage sometimes can lead to risks at the operational stage. And we refer to the first category as commercial risk and the latter as operational risk. So commercial risk refers to the risk regarding the contract negotiations and the contract decisions at the contracting stage, such as unsuitable contract decisions. Like in many cases, it happens that overpromise in the agreement, unsuitable payment mechanism, unsuitable KPIs, lack of clarity in the contracts, etc., or complex contract negotiations. So the negotiation process is very complex, time-consuming, and costly. And operational risk refers to the risk regarding the implementation and the delivery of outcome-based contracts, such as complexity in service delivery, providers failing to deliver required services, customers failing to achieve expected value, etc. And at the next stage, we try to identify the risk factors that can lead to commercial risk and operational risk. So 23 risk factors that can contribute to risks of outcome-based contracts are identified. I'm not going into detail in each of these risk factors, but I would like to introduce how these risk factors are categorized in 5 dimensions. So the first dimension is about complexity. The context where outcome-based contracts are adopted is very complex in general, where the providers are exposed to a lot of variables and uncertainty in many aspects. There are 5 risk factors that can be categorized in this dimension. the involvement of multiple stakeholders, diversified customer demands, unclear customer demands, complex contracts, and complex environment. Without realizing, analyzing, and reducing the context complexity, providers of outcome-based contracts can suffer from commercial risk and operational risk. And in the second dimension, we categorize some risk factors as dynamism. So in parallel with the dimension of complexity, which describes the current context of an outcome-based contract, another context factor is dynamism, which considers the timeline and reveals that outcome-based contracts are usually long-term contracts, and the dynamism and the fluidity are very common. And the three risk factors in this dimension are dynamic customer demands, dynamic environment, and long-term contracts. The dynamism can lead to both commercial and operational risk. And the third dimension is about capability. So lack of capability from key stakeholders, the provider, the customer, other partners, etc., is an important reason why commercial risk and operational risk happen. In this dimension, we categorize 6 risk factors that contribute to commercial risk and operational risk. And these are providers' lack of capabilities to contract outcome-based contract, providers' lack of capabilities to deliver outcome-based contract, providers' internal inconsistency, providers' internal resistance, and customers' lack of capabilities to consume the delivery and play their roles, and other stakeholders' lack of capabilities to perform. And the next dimension is alignment. So mismatching between the provider and the customer is identified to be an important dimension of risk factors, why commercial risk and operational risk happen. So alignment between the provider and the customer needs to be achieved in 6 aspects. And these are goals, visions, practices, understandings, culture, and bargaining power. The last dimension is dependency. So this dimension emphasizes, first, the extent to which the provider depends on customers and other stakeholders for the delivery of the services and solutions. And second, the extent to which the provider can control or influence the performances and behaviors of customers and other stakeholders. And third, the severity of consequences and impacts the providers has to bear due to the failure of customers and other stakeholders. Upfront investment, which is an important characteristic of outcome-based contracts, can also increase the provider's dependency, especially when the investments are contract-specific. Based on the 5 dimensions, the risk framework of outcome-based contract is proposed. It reveals that 5 dimensions of risk factors are complexity, dynamism as context factors, and capability, alignment, and dependency as stakeholder factors. 23 risk factors are categorized in these 5 dimensions, and they can lead to 2 broad categories of risk: commercial risk and operational risk. Commercial risk refers to risks regarding the contract negotiations and contract decisions, and operational risk refers to risks regarding the contract implementation and delivery. In many cases, commercial risk can also lead to operational risk. So for example, if unsuitable contract decisions happen during the negotiation, it will lead to risks in the operational stage. So in this paper, we also try to provide practical suggestions on risk management for practitioners of outcome-based contracts. So we analyze the contributions of each risk factor to commercial risk and operational risk, respectively. Though further quantitative study is required, the number in the table shows how many interviewees identify a risk factor to be the reason of commercial risk or operational risk. So for commercial risk, the most discussed risk factors are involvement of multiple stakeholders, providers' lack of capability to contract outcome-based contracts, diversified customer demands, providers' internal inconsistency, and long-term contracts. For operational risk, the most discussed risk factors are providers' lack of capabilities to deliver outcome-based contracts, customers' lack of capabilities to consume the delivery and to play their roles, involvement of multiple stakeholders, providers' internal inconsistency, and other stakeholders' lack of capabilities to perform, adding the contributions of risk factors to commercial risk and operational risk. Total contributions reveal that involvement of multiple stakeholders, providers' lack of capabilities to deliver outcome-based contracts, and providers' internal inconsistency should be paid high attention, as well as the dependency of customers in outcome-based contracts. So we provide some discussions. First, involvement of multiple stakeholders has been identified in this research to be highly accountable for both commercial and operational risk. So service providers should take key stakeholders into consideration at all stages of the contracts and balance their interests and priorities. And second, practitioners are concerned with the fact that most outcome-based contracts last for years, and it is difficult to predict what can happen within years when the contracts are negotiated. A long-term contract should be beneficial as long as flexibility is built in. So here, flexibility reveals a very important issue related with the long-term characteristic of outcome-based contracts. Firms using outcome-based contracts should be aware of and apply in the contracts where possible. Third, we emphasize that providers' lack of capabilities include not only the lack of capabilities to deliver outcome-based contracts, this has been discussed in the literature, but also the lack of capabilities to negotiate and to establish outcome-based contracts, as well as the lack of organizational capabilities such as internal inconsistency. Practitioners should enhance their capabilities and experiences of negotiating outcome-based contracts to reduce risks. Fourth, the literature does not pay special attention to the mismatching between the providers and customers in outcome-based contracts, and the mismatching and the potential contributions to risks. In this research, we identify that the mismatching between providers and customers from 6 aspects: goals, visions, practices, understandings, culture, and bargaining power can lead to commercial risk and operational risk. So practitioners should devote to reduce the gaps in these aspects and achieve alignment with the customers to reduce risks. And fifth, we propose that providers' dependency on customers and other stakeholders can increase risks. So understanding the dependency can facilitate providers to better understand potential risks they take in outcome-based contracts. Finally, our conclusions. So in this research, 23 risk factors in outcome-based contracts are identified in 5 dimensions: complexity, dynamism, capability, alignment, and dependency. The former 2 are regarding the context of outcome-based contract, and the latter 3 are regarding the stakeholders of outcome-based contract. Commercial risk at the contract negotiation stage and operational risk at the contract implementation stage are differentiated, and we analyzed and evaluated how the identified 23 risk factors contribute to commercial risk and operational risk respectively. And we propose a framework of outcome-based contract with theoretical and practical implications. Theoretically, it proposes a framework summarizing risks and risk factors of outcome-based contracts instead of individual risks and risk factors scattered in the literature. The framework lays a foundation for future research where researchers can further explore each dimension in detail and study how and to what extent it influences risks taken by providers. Opportunities also exist to explore how these dimensions can influence each other. Practically, it provides practitioners a neat way of thinking risks of outcome-based contracts. They need to understand the complexity and the dynamism of the context where outcome-based contracts are applied, and examine the capability, alignment, and dependency of stakeholders involved in the contract both at the contracting stage and at the implementation stage. So starting from this conceptual overview, practitioners can then probe into each dimension and evaluate the risk factors based on their situation. It opens some future research areas, so such as quantitative research on risks of outcome-based contracts, a comparison between the risks of outcome-based contracts and the risks of traditional contracts, etc. Thank you very much for your attention.